If you could step back in time just for one night and walk across the golden sands of ancient Egypt, while thousands-shaped stone beneath a sky dusted with stars, would you take that chance? That is exactly what we are going to do tonight. And no, this is not a scene from a Hollywood epic. There will be no burning suns overhead, no dramatic chants of slaves dragging blocks under whips, and absolutely no talking camels giving life advice. This is not myth. This is not spectacle. This is a quiet journey into the heart of one of humanity's most enduring dreams, the building of the pyramids. If you love stories that let you breathe the air of another age, that carry you gently through moments both sacred and simple, then make sure you are subscribed, hit that like button, and turn on notifications. Because what you are about to hear is not just history, it is a lullaby for the ages. The desert at night does not rush. It breathes slowly and deeply like a sleeping giant wrapped in silence. The sand still holds the warmth of the day, but the air above it is cooled, carrying the faint scent of dust, distant reeds, and the dry kiss of wind that has crossed nothing but emptiness for days. Above you, the sky is not just dark, it is infinite. Stars burn with a clarity they have lost in our modern world, sharp and close, as if you could reach up and gather them like seeds. The Milky Way spills across the heavens like powdered limestone, and somewhere low on the horizon, Sirius glimmers with its steady, watchful light, the star the builders followed long before telescopes or satellites ever reached for the sky. And ahead, rising from the edge of the plateau, something impossible begins to take shape. Not yet a pyramid, but the promise of one. A mound of stone carefully laid block by block, row by row. You can feel the presence of it before you see it clearly, a stillness in the air, a sense of purpose carved into the earth. This is not a tomb, not yet. It is a bridge between worlds, between mortal hands and eternal skies. Listen closely. Beneath your feet, the ground hums with movement. Not engines, not machines, but voices. Slow, rhythmic, steady. The sound of men shifting stone, of wooden sledges sliding over dampened sand, of ropes creaking under weight. Somewhere a flute plays a simple tune to keep the pace. A foreman murmurs instructions in a voice worn smooth by years. Water is passed in clay jugs, cool and sweet. Hands wipe sweat with cloth, not because they suffer, but because they work precisely, patiently together. This was not built in fury, it was built in focus, in faith, and time. Along the edge of the work site, small fires flicker, casting long shadows that dance across the faces of resting laborers. They are not slaves dragged from chains. They are masons, surveyors, bakers, brewers, doctors, and scribes, men who came from villages along the Nile, some volunteering for 3 months a year, fed well, treated with care, their names sometimes carved into the stones they lifted. This was not a curse. It was an honor, a calling. No. If you think they did it all without complaining, you should have heard them grumble about the commute from Thebes. Step closer. Run your fingers over the surface of the limestone. Feel how it has been smoothed by hand, not machine, each face shaped with copper chisels and endless patience. Notice how the blocks fit so tightly you cannot slide a blade between them. See how the corners align not by guesswork, but by stars, by water levels, by minds that understood angles and time better than we often give them credit for. Inside nearby huts, papyri are unrolled under oil lamps. Diagrams are drawn with charcoal. Someone calculates how many blocks remain. Another marks the days until the next shipment of granite arrives from Aswan, carried downriver on barges that move with the current, pulled by sails filled with the same wind that brushes your face now. And high above it all, the unfinished pyramid stands not as a monument to death, but as a declaration. We were here. We dreamed. We built. So let yourself settle into this moment. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift like sand on a breeze. Tonight, you are not a stranger to this place. You are a witness. Because history is not only made in battles and crowns. Sometimes it is made in silence, in repetition, in the quiet certainty of 1,000 hands lifting one stone at a time. If you would like to share where in time or space you are listening from, leave a comment below. It helps others feel less alone in the dark. Now let your eyes close. Let your body sink into stillness. Let us begin a journey not through chaos, but through calm, not through legend, but through light. Welcome to the night the pyramids learned to rise. Long before the pyramids rose from the dust, this land belonged entirely to the river, and the people who lived beside it knew this truth without needing to speak it aloud. The Nile was not simply a source of water, but the pulse of life itself, a quiet force that moved through the desert like a promise kept year after year. Each spring, the floodwaters swelled from distant rains far beyond the horizon and rolled slowly across, the land bringing with them a deep black silt, so rich and nourishing that grain would grow tall and strong without much effort from human hands. Farmers walked barefoot through the wet fields at dawn, their feet pressing into cool mud as they planted barley and emmer wheat. Their movements slow and steady like the rhythm of the river itself. Children ran ahead of them, chasing frogs between clumps of reeds, laughing. When the birds burst upward in sudden clouds, startled by small hands and loud voices, while dogs barked at nothing, and goats leapt over low walls in search of shade. Women sat on low stools near the edge of the water, grinding grain on flat stones, their arms moving with a practiced ease born of generations doing the same work under the same sun.
Ow.
The sound of the corns was soft and constant, like distant rain or wind through palm leaves, and it mixed with the splash of laundry beaten clean in shallow pools and the low calls of herders guiding cattle to drink. Boats made of bundled papyrus reeds drifted downstream carrying baskets of dates clay pots filled with oil and bundles of flax for weaving cloth. Some were small enough for one man, others wide and square with wooden masts built to carry heavy loads, and they moved with the current, never in a hurry, because there was no need to rush when the river gave everything in time. Smoke curled from cooking fires where fish caught that morning, sizzled over coals, and lentils bubbled in round clay pots. The smell of cumin, garlic, and roasted fennel hung in the air, mingling with the scent of damp linen animal fur and the dry sweetness of date syrup drizzled over flatbread. Along the banks, villages clustered close to the water where life was possible, and every house faced the river as if drawn to its presence. Were built from sun-baked bricks the color of dried earth, their walls cracked in places, but repaired each year with fresh layers of mud mixed with straw. Roofs were flat and used for sleeping when the nights were warm, and families would spread thin mats under the stars, listening to the crickets sing and watching the slow drift of constellations across the sky. Goats wandered freely between doorways, dogs rested in patches of shade, and old men sat on low stools, chewing bread slowly, their eyes calm as they watched the world go by. At dusk, lamps made of stone bowls filled with oil were lit and placed near doorways, not because anyone believed the light reached the gods, but because it felt right to send something gentle into the dark. These small flames flickered quietly like memories trying to stay awake. Temples existed, but they were simple places, small shrines really, with wooden posts carved with symbols and roofs made of woven palm fronds that rustled in the evening breeze. Priests wore clean white robes and offered bread, beer, and flowers to statues of gods, shaped from stone, but these deities did not feel distant or cruel. They lived in the flood and the drought and the crocodile that slipped beneath the surface without a ripple, and the hawk that circled high above, searching for movement in the grass. People spoke to them not in fear but in gratitude, giving thanks for water, grain, and safe passage through another season. A man might whisper a prayer before planting, or a woman might leave a piece of bread by the riverbank at dawn, not because she expected an answer, but because silence sometimes needed a voice. Life followed the land and did not fight against it. There were storms sometimes and years when the flood came too weak, or disappeared altogether, and then hunger followed, and voices grew quiet, and faces grew thin. But even in those times, people did not give up. They waited, they rebuilt. They trusted that the river would return, and when it did, they planted again, sang again, danced again, and life unfolded once more in its familiar way. The horizon was flat and complete. The stars moved in their ancient paths, the sun rose and set without fail, and the people lived within the circle of all these things, knowing their place and finding peace inside it. Time was not measured by clocks or calendars, but by seasons, by the height of the water, by the color of the sky at dawn and the direction of the wind. Death was not a mystery, but a natural part of the journey. The dead were buried in shallow graves marked by stones or heaps of sand, sometimes covered with woven mats, or small offerings of food and tools. A chief or elder might receive a larger mound, but nothing meant to last. The wind erased most traces within a season, and memory was carried not in stone but in stories told by firelight, in songs passed from parent to child in the way. A grandmother shaped bread, or a grandfather taught a boy to read the stars. A man was remembered not by what he built, but by what he gave, by how he walked through the world, and how he treated those who walked beside him. There was no need for monuments because everyone already knew his name. But peace does not mean stillness. Even in the quietest moments, change stirs beneath the surface, not with force, but with thought. In the mind of a man who watched the stars too long and noticed how certain constellations returned at the same time each year, in the heart of a ruler who stood at the edge of a burial mound and wondered why everything must vanish, why death should feel like an end. In the hands of a craftsman who smoothed a block of limestone, not because he had to, but because he wanted to see how perfect it could become. How close to flawless human hands could come. Ideas began to form, not loudly, not all at once, but in whispers carried on night winds and dreams, half remembered at dawn. In questions asked under the stars by men who no longer accepted that all things must fade. There was no single moment when the idea arrived. It grew slowly, like a plant pushing through dry soil, fed by quiet contemplation and growing confidence. Someone looked at the temples made of wood and reeds and asked why they could not be built from stone. Another studied the alignment of the stars and realized they could be used to mark directions with precision. A third saw how blocks of rock could be shaped and fitted together so tightly that not even a blade could slip between them. These were not revolutionary thoughts at first, just curiosities, just small steps taken in silence. But each one added weight to the growing sense that perhaps humanity could do more than survive. Perhaps it could create something that endured. The builders were not yet called architects or engineers. They were masons, surveyors, farmers, who also knew geometry from measuring fields. They were priests who tracked the heavens, and scribes who recorded numbers on papyrus with careful strokes of a reed pen. Knowledge passed from hand to hand, not in books, but in practice, in repetition, in the way a father showed his son. How to balance a load on a sledge, or how to pour water on sand to make it easier to slide. There was no rush, no pressure, only the slow accumulation of skill and understanding. Mistakes were made and learned from, not punished. Progress was not celebrated with fanfare, but with quiet satisfaction when a wall stood straight or a corner aligned perfectly with the rising sun. In the evenings, when the day's work was done, people gathered near small fires or sat on rooftops, looking out over the darkened fields. The air was cool and the stars bright, and someone might begin to tell a story not about gods or battles, but about a dream they had the night before, a vision of a structure so tall it touched the sky, or a staircase that led not to a roof but to the moon. Others would listen without laughing, because in that moment anything seemed possible. The world was large and silent and full of wonder, and the line between dream and reality was thinner than smoke. No one said it out loud, but some began to believe that maybe the next life did not have to be reached only through prayer. Maybe it could also be met halfway through a building, a pathway made of stone and intention. Seasons passed, the river flooded and receded. Children grew taller, old men closed their eyes for the last time. And still the idea remained, not forgotten, not urgent, but waiting like a seed in dry ground. Then one day a ruler stood on a high plateau overlooking the Nile and looked not at the present but at what could be. He did not shout orders or demand miracles. He simply asked a question of the man who had spent years studying shadows and angles and star patterns. What if we built something that lasts? It's not just for a lifetime but for 10 lifetimes. What if we created a home for the soul that would stand when everything else had turned to dust? That question was not answered quickly. It was held in silence for many nights. It was discussed in low voices over maps drawn in sand. It was tested with small models made of clay and wood, but eventually the answer came not in words but in action. A site was chosen. Tools were prepared. Workers were gathered not by force but by purpose. And so the first true step toward the pyramid was taken not with a shout, but with a decision made in stillness, a belief that something greater than survival was possible. The age of monuments had not yet begun, but its shadow was already falling across the sand, and in that moment history blinked. Not with thunder, or fire, or war, but with thought, with patience, the quiet turning of a single idea in the dark. The world remained unchanged on the surface. The river flowed, the stars turned, the people slept. But beneath it all, something new had entered the human mind, the belief that we are not only temporary, we can also leave behind something eternal. It's not because we seek glory, but because we dream, because we remember, because we hope. There was no single moment when the dream began, no thunderclap in the sky or sudden revelation that lit up the night like fire. It came slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the first faint line of light along the eastern horizon before dawn, so delicate that you might miss it if you were not looking. In the city of Memphis, where the Nile bends gently around the edge of the desert, and the air carries the scent of wet reeds and sun-warmed stone, someone stood alone one evening beneath the open roof of a small temple and looked up at the stars without speaking. He was not a king, nor a warrior returning from conquest, nor a man whose name was spoken in marketplaces or whispered in fear. He was a thinker, a watcher of patterns, a man who moved through the world with quiet attention, noticing things others passed by, how shadows fell at midday, how water flowed in channels, how the same stars returned year after year as if keeping a promise. His name was Imhotep, and though no statue bore his likeness in those early years, his mind already shaped the unseen currents of history, reshaping what was possible, not with force, but with patience, precision, and a belief that human hands could reach toward eternity. He had spent decades studying the movements of the heavens, tracing how certain constellations rose with unchanging rhythm, how others marked the coming of the flood or the turning of seasons, how Sirius appeared just before the river began to rise, as if the star itself called the waters forth. He knew the angles of sunlight at different times of year, how the sun crept higher in summer and dipped low in winter, casting long shadows that could be measured, mapped, understood. I had seen how even the grandest buildings made of reeds and mud would eventually return to dust. Their walls softened by rain, their roofs collapsed under the weight of time, till nothing remained but a depression in the earth and a few scattered fragments of pottery. But unlike others, he did not accept this as inevitable. He believed that if a man could learn the language of the stars and master the geometry hidden in nature, if he could align intention with order, then perhaps he could build something that would not vanish, not for glory, not for fear, but as an offering to balance. A bridge between life and what lies beyond, a place where the soul could rest knowing it had not been forgotten. Inside the temple, the air was still and cool, untouched by the lingering warmth of the day. Oil lamps burned low, their flames barely flickering, casting soft halos on the painted walls where gods with animal heads watched in silence, the falcon-headed Horus, the jackal-faced Anubis, the ibis-backed Thoth, who held the scales of knowledge. The floor was made of smoothed limestone, cool beneath his bare feet, worn slightly in places by generations of quiet footsteps. The columns rose tall and slender like trees in a forest that never swayed, carved with symbols that told stories not of war or power, but of cycles of death and rebirth, of the sun's journey through the underworld, of the eternal return. He walked slowly around the central chamber, pausing only to touch a carved symbol of Mat, the goddess of balance, truth, and cosmic order. Her feather was often weighed against the heart of the dead, and Imhotep often wondered if a building could also be weighed in such a way. Could a structure be true? Could it be just? Could it carry the weight of a soul without breaking? That night, he lit no incense and spoke no prayer aloud. He simply sat on a low stone bench near the altar, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees, and let his thoughts drift like boats on a calm river. He remembered standing at the edge of a burial mound years before, watching workers cover the body of a nobleman with sand and stones. He had seen the grief in the faces of the family, the emptiness that followed when there was nothing left to sino-marker, no memory carved in permanence, just wind and time doing their work, erasing everything as if it had never been. And he had asked himself then, not loudly, but in the quiet space between breaths, what if there were another way? What if instead of letting the earth swallow everything, we gave the departed a home that stood against the sky, not a tomb to hide death, but a monument to honor Lifa, a place where the living could return, not to mourn, but to remember, to speak, to feel the presence of someone who had walked before them. The idea did not come fully formed. It grew slowly, like a plant pushing through cracks in rock, fed by quiet contemplation and growing certainty. At first, it was only a question, then a sketch drawn in wet clay with the tip of a reed. Then a model made of small blocks stacked carefully one on top of another, each layer smaller than the one below. He showed it to no one at first, not because he feared rejection, but because he wanted to understand it himself. He studied how each level supported the next, how the weight distributed downward, how the shape directed the eye upward toward the heavens. He imagined a structure that was not just tall, but meaningful, that followed the path of the sun, aligned with the constellations that guided souls to the afterlife, that mirrored the steps of the gods as they climbed to the sky. He did not call it a pyramid yet. That word did not exist. He called it a stairway, a ladder, a vessel for the spirit, a place where the earthly and the eternal could meet without conflict. When he finally spoke of it to the pharaoh Djoser, it was not in a grand hall filled with courtiers or under the glare of torchlight. It was during a quiet evening walk along the palace gardens, where lotus flowers floated on still water and birds called softly from the trees. The air was warm, scented with jasmine and damp earth, and the sound of distant music drifted from a nearby courtyard. Imhotep did not say, "I will build you a pyramid." He said only, "What if your legacy did not fade with time? What if it rose with the morning sun and caught the light like a stairway to the stars?" The pharaoh stopped walking. He did not answer at once. He looked out over the Nile and watched a heron take flight, its wings cutting through the golden haze of sunset. Then he nodded once and said, "Show me." There was no celebration, no decree shouted from the rooftops. Just that quiet exchange, two men standing side by side, sharing a vision that would outlast them both. From that moment, the dream became real, not because of command or force, but because two minds aligned in purpose. One held power, the other held knowledge. Together, they began something neither could have done alone. Plans were drawn on papyrus with careful strokes of a reed pen, measurements recorded in cubits and palms, calculations made for slope angle, base width, and structural integrity. Workers were summoned not by force, but by invitation men, skilled in stonework, carpentry, surveying, logistics, and record-keeping. Camps were prepared near the plateau of Saqqara, where the land was firm and the view unobstructed, rising above the floodplain like a natural stage for something sacred. Nothing was rushed. Every decision was made with care, as if the entire meaning of the project depended on the smallest detail, the depth of a foundation, the alignment of a corner, the way light touched a surface at noon. Imhotep walked the site many times before construction began, always alone, always in silence. He stood where the center of the pyramid would be and turned slowly in a circle, taking in every direction. He noted how the sun rose in the east, how the west received the last light of day, how the northern stars remained fixed in the sky like eternal guardians. He marked alignments with wooden stakes and strings dipped in red ochre, ensuring that each side faced the cardinal points with near-perfect precision. He tested the soil by pressing his hand into the sand and feeling its depth and stability, ordering test pits dug to confirm the ground could bear immense weight. He listened to the wind and observed how it moved across the plateau, carrying grains of dust in slow spirals, shaping dunes over centuries. He did not treat the land as empty, treated it as a partner in the work to come, a silent witness to what would be built upon it. The first task was not to lift stone, but to prepare the ground. Teams of laborers cleared the surface, removing rocks and leveling the earth with wooden tools and copper blades. They dug a deep shaft at the center where the burial chamber would eventually lie far below the surface, descending into the bedrock like a root seeking water. Others began quarrying limestone nearby, cutting blocks with precision using wooden wedges soaked in water to split the rock along natural fault lines. These were not slaves dragged from chains or conquered lands. They were skilled artisans, farmers who worked seasonally, bakers, brewers, and scribes who kept records of every block moved. They ate well-bread, beer, onions, fish, and dates provided daily, and rested under shaded shelters during the hottest hours. Their names were sometimes scratched into the stones they handled, not as proof of ownership, but as a quiet claim. I was here. I helped. My hands touched this. As the foundation took shape, Imhotep returned again and again to the same question. How high can we go without breaking balance? He knew that ambition without wisdom would lead to collapse. So he started, not with a single massive form, but with layers. First, a mastoba flat-roofed tomb like those used for generations, then another on top, then another, each level smaller than the one below, creating a stepped shape that reached toward the sky like a ladder for the soul. It was not yet smooth, not yet perfect, but it was new, it was bold, it was intentional. He did not seek to defy gravity, but to work with it, to let the weight of each stone support the one above, distributing force evenly, creating stability through symmetry. This was not architecture as spectacle. It was architecture as philosophy, as prayer, as a physical expression of belief. Word of the rising structure spread slowly, carried by travelers, traders, and messengers. Some believed it was the work of gods, a celestial staircase descending to earth. Others whispered that the pharaoh sought to rival Ra himself, daring to climb where only deities belonged. But most people simply accepted it as part of the changing world, like the flood or the harvest. Children played near the edge of the worksite, pretending to be architects, giving orders in soft voices, stacking pebbles into tiny pyramids. Old men sat on stones, watching the progress hour after hour, saying little, because some things are too large for words. Priests visited to bless the corners and recite incantations at dawn, asking the gods to protect the builders and honor the purpose. Scribes recorded the number of blocks used, the days passed, the rations consumed. None of it was wasted. Every action had purpose. Every gesture carried meaning. And still, Imhotep worked. Not from pride, not from hunger for fame, but from devotion. He slept little and ate simply, his mind always returning to the structure, adjusting plans, refining details, solving problems before they arose. His hands grew rough from handling models and blueprints. His eyes carried the weight of responsibility, not because he feared failure, but because he understood what was at stake. This was not just a building. It was a belief made visible. A declaration that human beings could create order, beauty, and endurance, even in a world ruled by change. That we do not have to vanish completely. That we can leave behind something that says we were here. We dreamed, we tried. And in that trying, we honored not only the dead, but the very act of being alive. So the vision grew not in noise, not in haste, but in silence and patience. Brick by brick, block by block, thought by thought. And though no one could know it yet, history had already turned. The age of monuments had begun, not with a shout, but with a whisper spoken under stars by a man who believed that even the shortest life could cast a long shadow, one that would stretch across millennia, touching not only the sands of Egypt, but the dreams of anyone who dares to build something that lasts. There were no drums beating, no voices raised in celebration, no golden hammers striking ceremonial stone when the first block of the pyramid was set into place. It happened quietly, just after dawn, beneath a sky still pale with the memory of night, when the air carried the coolness of desert shadows retreating, and the first light touched the eastern rim of the plateau like a slow breath returning to life. A single block of limestone quarried from the high ground where the sun first kissed. The earth each morning was guided down wooden rollers by 6 men whose names have long since faded from record, but whose hands shaped eternity. They moved without rush, their bare feet pressing into the packed sand, their muscles taut but controlled, their eyes fixed on the delicate balance between effort and precision. Ropes of twisted hemp groaned under tension, dampened with water to keep them strong. And the sledge beneath the stone creaked as it settled forward in small increments, each movement measured not by speed but by certainty. When the block finally lowered into its bed of compacted gravel and fine river sand, there was only a soft, resonant thud, a sound so quiet it might have been the earth itself accepting what had been returned to it. But in that moment something irreversible occurred. The dream was no longer in the mind, it was in the ground. It was real. And though no one spoke, every man present felt it, the weight of beginning. The sacred gravity of starting something that would outlive them all. That stone had not arrived by accident or force. It had been chosen with care, shaped over days by masons who understood that even the smallest flaw could ripple through centuries. Quarried from the eastern ridge where sunlight fell earliest, was believed to carry the blessing of Ra, not because of superstition, but because intention shaped every decision. The workers who cut it used copper chisels hardened with arsenic, striking with rhythm, not fury, shaping edges until they met at perfect right angles, smoothing faces with dolerite pounders until they reflected the sky like still water. Every inch was checked with plumb lines and sighting rods, every surface tested against a master plane carved in wood. This was not mere construction, it was craftsmanship elevated to ritual. When oxen pulled it along the causeway, their hooves padded with reeds to prevent slipping. Water was poured ahead of the sledge to create a slick layer of mud, reducing friction, a technique passed down from farmers who once moved irrigation stones across flooded fields. The pace was glacial, deliberate, each foot of progress earned. And when it reached the foundation trench, the team guiding it did not cheer. They exhaled, they adjusted, they watched. Because this was not about strength. It was about trust in the stone, in the method, in the vision that said something lasting could rise from silence. Imhotep stood at the edge of the trench, arms folded, face still, eyes moving slowly over every detail. He did not give commands in that hour. He observed, he absorbed. He allowed the moment to unfold without interference, as if any word from him might disturb the fragile balance between thought and reality. For years, he had carried this idea in his mind, a structure that rose not to impress, but to endure, a stairway for the soul, a vessel aligned with stars and seasons. He had drawn plans on papyrus with a reed pen, calculated angles with ropes and stakes, argued with skeptics who said no building could stand so tall. But now that it was happening, he did not feel triumph. He felt responsibility, because this was no longer a sketch in sand or a model in clay. It was 2 tons of stone resting on the spine of time. If the foundation shifted, if the alignment drifted by a single degree, if the layers above pressed unevenly, the entire form could collapse not in violence, but in slow, inevitable failure. And the weight of that possibility rested not on the pharaoh, nor on the gods, but on the choices made here. Now, by men who believed that order could be built into the world. As more blocks followed, the rhythm of labor began to settle into a pattern as natural as breathing. Teams formed not by command, but by instinct quarrymen, who read the grain of stone like scribes read papyrus. Transporters who knew how to balance a load on shifting sand. Setters who placed each block with the care of a father tucking in a child. And inspectors who ran their fingers along joints to ensure not even a blade could slip between. Water was poured on the path ahead of sledges, not in excess, but in careful measure, creating a thin film that allowed movement without waste. The sound of work was not loud, but present a low creak of wood under strain. The scrape of stone on stone, the occasional murmur of a foreman correcting an angle, the soft tap of a wooden mallet nudging a block into perfect alignment. These were not sounds of toil, but of harmony, of people moving together, not because they were forced, but because they understood the quiet dignity of contributing to something greater than survival. No one counted how many blocks were laid each day. They counted only whether each one was true. In those early weeks, nothing was assumed. Every measurement was verified at dawn and again at dusk. The north-south axis was confirmed using a Merketa, simple wooden frame with a plumb line lined with the pole star, which hung low and steady above the desert, unchanged for generations. The east-west line was checked by marking the exact point where the sun rose and set, ensuring the corners faced the cardinal directions with near-perfect precision. Levels were maintained using shallow troughs filled with water, creating a perfectly horizontal reference across the growing base. Scribes sat in shaded pavilions, recording every detail on papyrus. The number of blocks, the rations consumed, the names of team leaders, the weather each day. Nothing was lost to memory. Everything was preserved, not for glory, but for continuity. Because this was not just a tomb. It was a promise written in stone that human beings could plan, execute, and endure. That knowledge could be passed from hand to hand, not through conquest, but through patience. The workers were not slaves dragged from chains or distant lands. They were skilled artisans, farmers who came during the inundation season, when fields lay under water, bakers, brewers, carpenters, and surveyors who traveled from villages along the Nile, drawn not by force, but by purpose. They were fed 3 meals a day, barley bread, onions, fish, dates, and beer brewed specially for them, thick and nutritious, enough to sustain long hours under the sun. They wore linen garments, received oil for their skin to protect against dust and heat, and had access to basic medical care when injured. Records later uncovered in nearby worker settlements reveal names like Kumhotep, the stone layer, or Jeti, the rope master, written not as property, but as individuals recognized for their skill. Their hands were calloused, their backs bore the marks of labor, but their spirits were not broken.
Wow.
They knew they were part of something new, something unseen. And in the evenings, when the sun dipped below the western cliffs, they gathered in circles, sharing stories, laughing about the foreman who tasted mortar to check its consistency, or joking that the oxen were starting to walk with more dignity than the men. Each evening, as darkness spread across the plateau, the work slowed and then stopped. Tools were cleaned and stored, ropes coiled with care, sledges left in place for the next day. Men washed dust from their faces in basins of cool water, sat together, and spoke softly. Some told dreams they'd had the night before, visions of climbing endless stairs into the sky, or walking beside the Pharaoh in a land of eternal light, where rivers flowed with milk and trees bore fruit of gold. Others spoke of home of children learning to write, of wives planting new gardens, of elders who remembered when all tombs were buried in sand. There was no bitterness, no resentment, only the quiet satisfaction of having moved something immovable, even if only by a few feet. And as oil lamps flickered to life along the edge of the camp, casting long shadows that danced across tents and temporary shrines, the air filled with the scent of roasted fish and the low hum of conversation, like a lullaby sung to the sleeping earth. Imhotep walked the site each night after the others had gone to rest. He placed his hand on the newly laid stones, feeling their coolness, tracing the joints between them with his fingers. Listening to the wind move over the plateau, like a whisper from the unseen. He did not pray aloud, but he thought deeply about balance, not just of weight and structure, but of meaning. Was this truly a home for the soul? Or was it also a mirror for the living, showing them what focus, unity, and patience could achieve? He believed it was both. That the pyramid was not only for Djoser, but for everyone who touched it. That in lifting stone, they were also lifting themselves. That every act of precision, every moment of care, was a quiet rebellion against chaos, a declaration that order could be built, even in a world ruled by change. Seasons passed. The first mastaba level was completed, its flat roof sealed with fine white limestone polished, until it caught the sunlight like bone. Then came the second layer, smaller, centered, precisely above the first, then the third. Each required more effort, more precision, as the height increased and the distance from the quarry grew. Ramps of mud brick and timber were built at a gentle incline, winding around the growing structure like a serpent embracing its own coils, designed to bear weight without collapsing. More men joined the work, not out of obligation, but curiosity, drawn by word of mouth, by the sense that history was unfolding in silence. New techniques emerged, better ways to cut stone, stronger mortar made with gypsum and ash, improved methods for measuring angles using water levels and shadow sticks. Knowledge was shared freely, passed from master to apprentice, written in notebooks, whispered in the shade during rest. Stakes were corrected without anger. A misaligned block was not discarded but reworked. Cracked stone was not wasted but repurposed for less visible areas. Time was not measured by speed but by truth. And still, no one rushed. The pyramid was not rising because of strength alone, but because of continuity, because tomorrow someone else would return to the same spot and place another stone exactly where it belonged, trusting that the ones before had done the same. Children sometimes visited, brought by fathers who wanted them to see what humans could do. They ran along the cleared paths, pointed at the towering form, asked endless questions. Will it touch the moon? Can we live inside it? Did the gods help build it? The adults smiled and answered gently, not with myths, but with truth. No, the gods did not build it. We did. With our hands, with our minds, with time. And in those moments, the future began to understand the past before it had even happened. Years passed, stepped pyramid grew taller, layer by layer, until it reached a height no structure had ever achieved. 7 tiers rose into the sky, each one a step toward the unseen, each one a promise kept. People from distant provinces came to see it, standing in silence at its base, looking up without speaking, feeling something ancient stir within them. Not awe, not fear, but recognition. As if they saw in its form something they already knew: a path upward, a desire to endure, a quiet refusal to be forgotten. Priests began to speak of it not just as a tomb, but as a bridge between worlds. Scribes recorded its dimensions with reverence. Travelers carried stories of it downriver, and soon other rulers looked toward Saqqara and asked, could we build such a thing? And so, the first steps became a journey. Not a sudden leap, but 1,000 small decisions made in calm, guided by vision, held together by patience. The pyramid was no longer just a tomb. It was a testament to thought, to unity, to the belief that even the shortest life can leave a mark that lasts beyond memory. And as the wind swept across the plateau, carrying grains of sand against its smooth surfaces, it whispered back not of death, but of beginnings, of hands that shaped stone, of minds that dared to imagine, of a single block placed with care that started it all. The silence that once wrapped the plateau of Saqqara like a veil began, ever so gently, to lift not because of noise, but because of attention. It was not broken by drums or proclamations, but by the slow turning of heads, the soft shift in conversation. The way people paused mid-step when they heard the name Imhotep spoken not as an official, but as a man who had made stone rise like a prayer answered. Word traveled not through royal decree, but through the quiet exchanges between travelers resting beneath sycamore trees, between bakers kneading dough at dawn, between mothers whispering stories to children tucked beneath linen sheets. A structure was being built, a stairway of stone, 7 levels high, aligned with the stars, standing where flat land had been for thousands of years. And though few had seen it, nearly everyone now carried its image in their mind, shaped not by sight but by imagination. It existed not only in the desert, but in dreams in the space between breaths, in the hush before sleep, in the part of the soul that longs to leave something behind. From Memphis downriver to the Delta, and southward toward Thebes, the rhythm of daily life continued as it always had, the planting of barley, the grinding of grain, the tending of flocks. But now, woven into these routines was a new thread: wonder. Fishermen mending their nets by lamplight would pause and ask one another how such a thing could stand without collapsing. Whether the blocks were held by magic or by some hidden knowledge passed from the gods. Farmers walking barefoot through wet fields at sunrise would glance westward, not to check the weather, but to imagine the shadow the pyramid cast at this very hour, stretching across the sand like a finger pointing toward eternity. Children played differently now, no longer just chasing goats or splashing in shallow water, but arranging stones into careful tiers, whispering names like Djoser and Saqqara, as if speaking them gave power to their small creations. Even the elders, who had lived long enough to see floods come and go, empires rise and fade, found themselves sitting a little straighter when the subject arose, their eyes distant, as if trying to measure the weight of what humanity had dared to do. Traders became unintentional messengers, carrying not only goods but stories. A merchant returning from the capital might unroll a scrap of papyrus showing a rough sketch of the pyramid, drawn from memory after hours of silent observation. He wouldn't present it with fanfare, but quietly, almost shyly, as if sharing a secret too vast for words. Stonemasons in Torah, known for their fine white limestone, would gather around it, tracing the angles with calloused fingers, murmuring about slope and symmetry, about how the layers diminished in size with such precision that the eye could not detect error. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. Others sat in silence, recalibrating their understanding of what was possible. For generations, stone had been used for thresholds, for temple walls, for tombs buried beneath sand. But this was different. This was not concealment. This was declaration. And in that moment, the purpose of building began to shift, not overnight, but like the Nile changing course over centuries, imperceptible at first, then undeniable. In villages along the riverbanks, the idea of permanence began to seep into everyday choices. Totter and Athribis started marking his finest vessels with small symbols, not just to identify his work, but because he thought perhaps someone might find them long after he was gone. A scribe in Hermopolis began teaching his students not only hieroglyphs, but geometry, how to divide a circle, how to calculate volume, how to align a structure with the cardinal points. These were not royal mandates, were personal decisions, born from the quiet conviction that knowledge, like stone, could outlast flesh. Parents told their children that Imhotep had not shouted orders or demanded obedience, but walked among the workers, listening, adjusting, teaching. And so, slowly, respect began to move from force to wisdom. The man who knew was becoming more valued than the man who commanded. Even the priests, guardians of tradition, found their teachings subtly reshaped. For centuries, they had spoken of the afterlife as a journey through darkness, a passage requiring spells, amulets, and the protection of gods. But now, some began to describe the soul's ascent as a klima, deliberate step-by-step movement upward, guided not only by ritual, but by the shape of the world itself. They pointed to the pyramid not as proof of divine intervention, but as a physical manifestation of faith, a bridge between earth and sky built by human hands, guided by celestial order. Hymns were quietly revised. Offerings were left not only at tombs, but at high places, hilltops, rooftops, any spot where the stars felt closer. In private, some admitted they had never truly believed mortals could touch eternity, till they saw it happening before their eyes. The quarries themselves changed. In Tura and Aswan, where limestone and granite had been extracted for generations, the work grew more precise, more intentional. Masons smoothed faces until they reflected light like still water. They checked corners with sighting rods and plumb lines, not because overseers demanded it, but because they now understood that every surface mattered, that imperfection, even if unseen, weakened the whole. Transporters experimented with better sledges, using harder woods and tighter lashings, pouring water on sand not just to ease movement, but to honor the technique they had heard was used at Saqqara, knowledge. Once guarded like temple secrets, began to flow more freely, not through grand schools, but through shared labor, through apprentices watching masters, through old men whispering methods to young ones over clay jugs of beer. And in that exchange, something sacred was preserved. The belief that skill, passed hand to hand, was its own kind of immortality. Children grew up hearing Imhotep's name not as myth, but as example. Parents told them how he walked the site each night, placing his hand on the newly laid blocks, feeling for misalignment, ensuring every joint was true. How he never punished mistakes harshly, but asked questions, believing correction was more powerful than fear. How he studied the stars not for omens, but for alignment, seeing the heavens not as distant gods, but as guides. And so, in small homes along the Nile, boys and girls began to dream not only of becoming scribes or priests, but of understanding the world in deeper ways, of measuring angles, reading shadows, learning the language of balance. Education, once reserved for the elite, began to ripple outward, carried not by decree, but by curiosity. A farmer's son might spend evenings tracing diagrams in the sand. A weaver's daughter might memorize star patterns. The pyramid did not teach directly, it inspired indirection, like a single flame lighting countless others in the dark. In distant courts, rulers watched with growing interest. Some mocked the effort, calling it vanity, a waste of grain and labor better spent on armies or granaries. But others sent envoys, not soldiers, not spies, but quiet observers, disguised as laborers, scribes, or merchants. They recorded everything: the layout of the ramps, the depth of the foundation, the way mortar was mixed with gypsum and ash to strengthen it. They noted how workers were fed, how shifts were organized, how disputes were settled without violence. When they returned, they spoke not of conquest, but of order, of a civilization capable of uniting thousands around a single purpose without chains. And though few would admit it aloud, the idea took root. If one king could build such a thing, perhaps others could as well. The dream of permanence was no longer unique, it was contagious. Yet, not everyone welcomed the change. In hidden chambers of ancient temples, a few priests whispered that this defiance of decay threatened the natural order. They believed death should remain mysterious, not framed in stone. They feared that if humans could cheat oblivion, they might forget humility. One elder in Heliopolis closed his eyes during prayer and murmured, "We are dust. We return to dust. That is the law." But even he, on quiet nights, found himself walking to the edge of the city and looking westward, toward the distant plateau where the pyramid caught the last light of day like a flame that refused to die. He did not speak of it again. But he stopped discouraging the young acolytes from studying Imhotep's methods. And sometimes he could be seen sketching angles in the sand, just to see if they would align. And still, life went on. The Nile flooded and receded. Crops were planted and harvested. Babies were born, elders passed, and festivals filled the air with music and incense. But now, these rhythms carried a new undercurrent, a sense that the world was not fixed, that progress was possible, not through upheaval, but through patience. A farmer repairing his irrigation ditch might pause and wonder how the builders kept water perfectly level across vast distances. A mother weaving linen might think of the ropes used to pull stone and consider how strength could be multiplied through design. The pyramid did not demand attention. It simply existed. In existing, it invited reflection. It asked nothing. It offered everything. Pilgrimages began, not of the religious kind, but of quiet witnessing. Men and women traveled for days to stand at the base of the structure, to place their hands on its cool surface, to walk around it in silence. They did not pray. They did not weep. They simply stood, absorbing its presence, feeling the immensity of what humans could do when they worked not for power, but for meaning. Some stayed for hours, others camped nearby for nights, sleeping beneath the same stars that had watched over the builders. And when they returned home, they carried nothing physical, no relics, no souvenirs, but something deeper. The certainty that beauty, order, and endurance were not myths, but choices. That a single decision repeated every day could become a mountain. Years passed. The pyramid was completed, its final capstone polished with gold leaf, so it would catch the dawn like a second sun. But the movement it sparked did not end. Other rulers began planning their own monuments, not mere copies, but variations, some smoother, some taller, some buried deeper in the earth. The idea evolved, the techniques improved, the dream expanded, and though later pyramids would surpass Djoser's in height, none would carry the same quiet miracle of being the first, the moment when humanity, without fanfare, decided to reach for permanence. So the world moved, not in leaps, but in waves. A whisper here, a question there, a child stacking stones in the sand, a scribe copying a diagram, a farmer aligning his grave with the east. The pyramid did not shout, it stood. And in standing, it changed everything, not by force, not by command, but by presence. By proving that patience, unity, and quiet courage could build something that outlived memory. Something that still speaks today, not in words, but in silence. There were no battles fought at Saqqara, no voices raised in anger, no public disputes under the open sky, but beneath the steady rhythm of construction, beneath the quiet pride of those who placed each stone with care, there existed a different kind of struggle, one that did not announce itself, but lived in the silence between breaths. In the way a man might pause before speaking, or how a foreman would stare at a misaligned block long after the others had gone to rest. It was not rebellion. It was not failure. It was the natural tension that arises when humans attempt something that has never been done, when vision meets reality, when belief is tested not by enemies, but by time, by doubt, by the slow erosion of certainty. And though no monument was ever built without such moments, they are rarely spoken of, because they do not belong to history as it is recorded, but to the heart, as it beats in the dark. Imhotep felt at first not as fear, but as a subtle shift in the air, like the moment before a storm when the wind stops and everything listens. He had walked the site for months with confidence, his steps measured, his mind clear. But one evening, as he stood alone at the edge of the rising pyramid, watching the last light slide across the fourth tier, he found himself questioning whether the structure could truly hold. Not because of any flaw he had seen, but because of the sheer impossibility of what they were doing. For thousands of years, tombs had been buried, hidden, returned to the earth. Now they were building upward, defying gravity, drawing attention rather than concealing it. Was this balance? Or was it hubris disguised as devotion? He did not speak these thoughts aloud. He carried them like a secret, weighing each decision more carefully in the days that followed, checking alignments twice, asking masons to rework joints that were already true. It was not mistrust in the work, but in himself, in the quiet voice that whispered, "What if we are wrong?" Others felt it too in ways they could not name. A young setter named Nebi, responsible for positioning blocks on the upper levels, began waking before dawn, his body tense even in sleep. He had once taken pride in his precision, in the way his team moved as one, their rhythm steady, their focus unwavering. But now, every time a stone settled into place, he would return hours later to touch the joint, to run his fingers along the seam, searching for imperfection. He knew logically that the structure was sound, that the calculations were correct, that the foundation was deeper than any before. But emotionally, the height unsettled him. From up there, the world looked different, the river a silver thread, the villages specks of dust, the horizon endless. And standing so close to the sky, he could not shake the feeling that they were trespassing. Not on land, but on a boundary meant to remain uncrossed. He never said this to anyone, simply worked harder, as if effort could silence the unease. In the workers' village, whispers passed like shadows along the walls of mud-brick homes. Some spoke of dreams of falling from great heights, of stones cracking open to reveal empty chambers, of stars falling from the sky and landing in the desert with soft thuds. Others told of omens, a jackal seen walking east at midnight, a well that suddenly turned bitter, a child born with fingers fused together like stone. These were not accusations. They were expressions of something deeper, the collective anxiety of hundreds of lives tied to a single purpose. For the success of one was the success of all, and the failure of one would mean the collapse of everything. No one wanted to admit fear, not out of pride, but because to speak it was to give it power. So instead, they observed rituals quietly, leaving small offerings of bread and water at the base of the pyramid, whispering prayers to Ptah before beginning work, ensuring that every tool was cleaned and stored with care, as if neglect in the smallest thing might unravel the greatest. Even the scribes, usually calm and detached, began to double-check their records. One man, a many, who had faithfully logged the number of blocks laid each week, started revisiting old papyri, recalculating totals, measuring distances again and again, not because he suspected error, but because the numbers themselves began to feel unreal. 20,000 blocks, 70 cubits high, 7 tiers reaching toward the pole star. These figures belonged not to daily life, but to myth. And yet here they were, written in ink, confirmed by sight. I found himself pausing during meals, staring into the fire, wondering if future generations would believe this had happened, or if they would dismiss it as exaggeration, like stories of gods walking among men. He considered writing a note in the margin. This is true. I was here, but decided against it. Some truths, he realized, must be felt, not proven. At night, when the plateau fell into stillness, Imhotep often walked the ramps alone, his sandals brushing against the rough stone, his breath slow, his hands clasped behind his back. He did not go to inspect. He went to listen, to the wind moving over the tiers, to the distant call of a fox, to the silence within himself. He knew that leadership was not only about vision, but about holding space for doubt without letting it spread. He could not show uncertainty, not because he feared losing authority, but because he understood that thousands relied on his calm. And so, he carried the weight silently, absorbing questions without answering them, allowing others to believe in the dream, while he quietly questioned its edges. It was not deception, it was protection. The kind of courage that asks nothing in return, that stands in the dark so others can walk in the light. There were moments when the work slowed not, because of fatigue or shortage, but because of hesitation. A team would gather around a new block, ropes in hand, sledges ready, and yet no one would speak. The foreman would glance at the ramp, then at the sky, then at the men, as if waiting for permission from something beyond. And sometimes it was an elder worker who broke the silence, not with a command, but with a memory. My father told me that when they built the temple at Heliopolis, the stones sang as they were lifted. Or, I once saw a falcon circle this spot 3 times at dawn. That was the day we began. These were not facts. They were anchored small stories thrown into the sea of uncertainty to keep everyone from drifting. Slowly the rhythm would return. The ropes would tighten. The chant would begin. The stone would move. Not everyone believed in the pyramid. In a nearby village, an old priest refused to look westward, turning his face east whenever he walked, as if denying the structure's existence could preserve the old order. He taught his students that permanence was not for mortals, that the soul did not need stairways, only truth. And yet even he could not stop the change. His own grandson, a bright boy who studied mathematics, began sketching designs for a smaller stepped tomb, aligning it with Orion's belt. The old man said nothing. He did not forbid it. He only watched, his expression unreadable as the future shaped itself in silence. No. There was no victory in this moment, no defeat, only the quiet understanding that some ideas cannot be contained. Not by doctrine, not by time, not even by faith. A sandstorm came one spring, fierce and sudden, howling across the plateau for 2 full days, burying tools, shifting ramps, covering half-finished layers in fine dust. When it passed, the workers returned to find their progress obscured, the pyramid softened by wind, its sharp edges blurred. Some stood in silence, unsure whether to begin clearing or to wait. But Imhotep walked forward without hesitation, knelt beside the lowest tier and began brushing the sand away with his hands. He did not speak. He did not call for help. He simply worked, slowly, deliberately, until others joined him one by one. Until the entire team was kneeling, sweeping, scraping, restoring what had been covered. It was not about speed. It was about continuity. About showing that even when the world tries to erase you, you return not with anger, but with patience. There were losses too, though not of stone or structure. A mason named Hori fell from the 3rd level during a routine inspection, landing on packed earth below. He did not die, but his leg was broken, and he would never walk the same again. The camp fell into quiet grief, not just for his pain, but for the loss of his presence in the work. He had been known for his gentle humor, for the way he carved tiny birds into unused limestone scraps and gave them to children. When Imhotep visited him in the healing tent, Hori did not blame the pyramid. He said only, "I was careless. The wind caught my cloak." And when Imhotep offered to record his name in the master log as one of the first builders, Hori smiled and said, "I am already there," and my hands touched the stone. There was no drama in this moment, no grand speech, only dignity, only acceptance. And in that simplicity, a deeper truth emerged, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to continue. As the years passed and the pyramid neared completion, the nature of the conflict shifted. It was no longer about whether it could stand, but about what it meant. Some workers began to wonder if they were building a home for the pharaoh's soul or a monument to human ambition. Priests debated whether the stairway led to the stars or simply reminded people of their limits. Parents asked their children what legacy meant and received answers shaped by the very structure that loomed over the land. There was no resolution, no final answer. Only the ongoing conversation between belief and doubt, between what is built and what is felt. And perhaps that was the point, that great things are not created in certainty, but in the space between knowing and not knowing. Where courage is not loud, but quiet enough to hear your own breath. One evening, near the end of construction, a young apprentice approached Imhotep with a question he had clearly rehearsed. "Master," he said, "if the pharaoh is gone and we are finished, will anyone remember why we built this?" Imhotep looked at him for a long time, then gestured to the nearly completed pyramid, its capstone not yet in place. "They may forget our names," he said. "They may forget the measurements, the methods, even the pharaoh's name. But as long as someone stands here and looks up, they will remember the feeling, and that is enough." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing the weight of the reply. He returned to his work, and Imhotep remained, watching the sun set behind the tiers, casting long shadows that stretched across the desert like fingers reaching into the past. The conflicts never fully disappeared, even after the final stone was set, even after the gold capstone caught the dawn. There were those who doubted, who feared, who wondered if it had all been worth the grain, the labor, the lives altered. But there were also those who stood at the base, placed their hands on the cool limestone, and felt something stir within them, a sense of possibility, of unity, of having been part of something larger than survival. And in that duality, the true legacy began. Not perfection, but perseverance. Not absence of fear, but action despite it. So the quiet conflicts remained, not as wounds, but as proof that thought had taken place, that humanity had wrestled with meaning and chosen to build anyway. And in that choice, in that silent courage, the pyramid became more than stone. It became a mirror for those who dared to dream, for those who hesitated, for those who continued, one step at a time, into the unknown. There was no announcement, no gathering of voices, no signal from horn or drum to mark the night it happened. It arrived like any other evening in the high season of building softly, gradually, almost unnoticed as the sun slipped below the western cliffs and painted the desert in long ribbons of amber and violet, colors so deep they seemed to bleed into the sand itself. The work had ended hours before. Tools were stored in wooden chests, lined with cloth to protect their edges. Ropes coiled neatly on low shelves. Men had returned to their shelters, washed dust from their skin with basins of cool water, eaten their meals of barley bread, onions, and beer brewed thick for strength, and now lay beneath woolen cloaks, listening to the crickets sing and the wind move over the plateau like a breath exhaled after long silence. Fires burned low in small stone circles, their embers glowing faintly, casting trembling halos on the ground. And yet, as the stars emerged, one by one Sirius first, then Orion's belt, then the slow arc of the Milky Way, something intangible shifted in the air. Not a sound, not a movement, but a stillness, so complete it felt like anticipation held without breath. High on the upper tiers of the nearly completed pyramid, where the air was cooler and the stars seemed closer, Imhotep stood alone, his sandals silent against the smooth limestone, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the final layer, waiting for something only he knew was coming. He had not told anyone the significance of this night. He had not needed to. For months he had studied the path of the sun at dawn, tracking how its first light touched the eastern face of the structure during the days leading up to the summer solstice. He had measured shadows cast by sighting rods at precise intervals, recorded the angles in papyrus notebooks filled with neat columns of ink, adjusted the alignment of the capstone foundation by fractions of a finger's width, correcting imperfections invisible to the eye, ensuring that when the time came, the geometry would be perfect. Not for show, not for power, but for meaning. This was not just about precision, it was about harmony. It's about aligning the last piece of the structure not only with the earth, but with the heavens. And tonight, as Sirius rose in the southeast and Orion's belt hung low above the horizon, he knew the stars were in place. All that remained was to wait for the sun. He did not pace. He did not check his instruments again. He simply stood, eyes closed at times, feeling the temperature shift as the night deepened. Listening to the subtle creaks of cooling stone, the distant call of a fox, the slow rhythm of his own breath, his mind wandered not to calculations, not to plans, but to moments long past. The day the first block was laid, when the weight of beginning pressed against his chest like a stone. The nights he walked the site alone, wondering if the layers would hold, if ambition had outgrown wisdom. The faces of men who had worked for years, some now gone, others resting nearby, unaware that the dream they helped carry was nearing completion. He remembered Nebi, the young setter who once feared the height, standing frozen before a misaligned block, not from anger, but from awe at what they were doing. He remembered Hori, the mason who fell, whose laughter still echoed in the camp despite his broken leg. And he remembered Djoser, the pharaoh who had trusted him not with commands but with silence. None of them had sought glory. They had simply believed in the work. And now, standing so close to the end, Imhotep felt not triumph, but gratitude for the hands that shaped the blocks, for the minds that preserved knowledge, for the quiet courage of ordinary people who chose to build something that would outlast them all. Below him, the workers' village slept. Smoke curled faintly from a few dying fires. Somewhere a child stirred in sleep, murmuring words too soft to hear. A dog barked once, then fell silent, as if reminded of the hour. The plateau itself felt still, as if holding its breath. Even the wind had softened, brushing across the stone like a hand-smoothing fabric, carrying grains of sand that settled gently against the base of the pyramid. Imhotep opened his eyes and looked not at the people, but at the capstone, a single block of fine white limestone quarried from Tura. Polished to a mirror finish, its base already fitted into the prepared socket. It had not been raised yet. It waited just behind him, covered in linen, dyed with ochre, as if even stone deserved reverence before being placed. He placed his palm flat against its surface, feeling the coolness, the smoothness, the weight of what it represented. Not an end, but a threshold. At some point, Nebi appeared at the base of the ramp. He did not call out, he did not climb immediately. Stood there, wrapped in a linen shawl, watching Imhotep's silhouette against the starlight. He had been unable to sleep, his mind restless, as if something unseen was calling him upward. For weeks, he had dreamed of standing at the summit, not as a worker, but as a witness. When he finally began the slow ascent, his steps were careful, deliberate, each one placing weight gently on the ancient stones. He did not speak when he reached the top. He simply stood beside Imhotep facing east and waited. Others followed not because they had been summoned, but because the silence pulled them. Ameni the scribe came, carrying no tablet, no pen. Hori arrived, leaning on a staff carved from acacia wood, his movements slow but steady. Two foremen ascended without speaking. A priest from Memphis, who had come days before and said little since, joined them. None of them had been told. None of them knew why they were drawn there. They simply arrived one by one, until a small circle stood at the summit, not speaking, not moving. United only by the shared sense that something sacred was about to unfold. The sky lightened slowly, not all at once, but in layers. First, the deepest black faded to indigo. Then a pale glow gathered along the horizon, soft and diffuse, like breath on glass. The stars did not vanish, they simply withdrew, their brilliance dimmed by the coming light. Still no one spoke. The cold seeped through their cloaks, but no one shifted. They stood like statues, rooted in stillness, their faces turned toward the east, their eyes fixed on the line where sky met land. Imhotep opened his eyes and placed his hands on the linen covering the capstone. He did not give a command. He did not speak, but the gesture was understood. Together, in silence, they uncovered the stone, revealing its polished surface, catching the first hints of dawn. It shimmered faintly, not yet lit, but waiting. Then, without warning, the first ray of sunlight pierced the horizon. It did not burst forth, but emerged gently, like a hand reaching through darkness. And as it touched the eastern face of the pyramid, something extraordinary happened. The entire surface began to glow not with fire, not with reflection, but with a deep inner radiance, as if the stone itself had absorbed the memory of light and now gave it back. The beam traveled slowly upward, climbing tier by tier, revealing each level as it passed, until it reached the summit there. As if guided by invisible hands, it struck the side of the capstone and flared into brilliance, casting a golden halo across the waiting figures. For a long moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The world seemed suspended, caught between night and day, between effort and completion, between mortality and memory. Imhotep stepped forward, removed the linen completely, and placed his hands on the stone. He did not look at the others. He did not speak. But the others understood. Together, in silence, they guided the capstone into place, lowering it with ropes and wooden levers. Their movements slow, precise, reverent. There was no strain, no rush, no word spoken, only the soft creak of wood, the whisper of rope, the gentle thud as the stone settled perfectly into its socket. When it was done, a soft sigh passed through the group, not of relief, but of completion. It was done. Not because of force, not because of power, but because of patience, unity, and belief. The pyramid was whole, not just in form, but in spirit. In that instant, something shifted, not in the structure, but in the people. The pyramid was no longer a project, it was a presence, a living part of the land. a bridge between what had been dreamed and what now existed. Hori, leaning on his staff, wept quietly, not for his lost ability to walk the ramps, but for having lived to see this. Nebi closed his eyes and felt, for the first time, that fear had not been weakness, but part of the journey. Ameni later wrote in his records not of angles or numbers, but of light and how it moved not just across stone but through hearts. The priest from Memphis whispered a prayer not to Ra but to Marat, thanking her for balance. And Imhotep, for the first time in years, smiled not widely, not loudly, but with a quiet release, as if a great weight had been set down, not in the earth, but in peace. Imhotep did not stay to watch the full sunrise. After placing a single lotus flower at the base of the capstone, bloom picked from the riverbank that morning, he descended the ramp slowly, his steps lighter than they had been in years. He did not look back. He did not need to. Knew the pyramid would stand. Not because of him, but because of everyone who had touched it, believed in it, doubted it, and continued anyway. The turning point was not the placement of the stone. It was the quiet understanding that had grown among them that greatness is not built in moments of glory, but in nights of stillness, in choices made without witnesses, in the courage to keep going when no one is cheering. That legacy is not declared. It is lived. And so, the morning came, ordinary in every way except one. The world now contained something it had not held before, not just a monument, but a testament to thought, to care, to the quiet power of human hands guided by vision. The birds began to sing. The workers woke. Life resumed. Fires were relit. Bread was baked. Children ran through the camp. But nothing was quite the same, because once you have stood at the edge of eternity and helped bring it into being, even for a moment, you carry that light with you into sleep, into dreams, into whatever comes next. Years later, travelers would speak of a certain quality of dawn at Saqqara. How the light climbs the pyramid with such precision, it seems rehearsed. Some would say it was the work of gods. Others would claim it was mere chance. But those who had been there, who had stood in silence on that night, knew the truth. It was neither miracle nor accident. It was intention. It was attention. It was the result of thousands of small decisions made with care, of hands that never stopped, of minds that believed in something beyond survival. And though none of them sought to be remembered, they were because what they built did not just endure. It taught, because once a stone has caught the light in the right way, the world cannot forget how it felt to witness it. When the final stone was set, and the workers stepped back for the first time without tools in their hands, there was no celebration, no feast laid out beneath torchlight, no song sung in honor of what had been completed. Instead, there was a silence so deep it felt like the world itself was holding its breath, pause not of emptiness, of fullness, as if every moment of effort, every whispered doubt, every act of patience had settled into the land, and now waited to be acknowledged. The pyramid stood whole, its 7 tiers rising with perfect symmetry against the sky, its polished capstone catching the morning sun like a flame that refused to flicker. It was beautiful. It was immense. And yet for many who had built it, the completion did not bring joy, but something quieter, more complex, something closer to grief, because endings are never clean. They carry the weight of beginnings, of all that came before, of all that was left behind. To finish something so vast was not triumph, but release, and release often feels like loss, even when it is right. Men walked the plateau alone in the days after the last block was laid, not to admire the structure, but to trace the path they had walked for years, the causeway worn smooth by sledges. The edge of the foundation trench where the first stone was placed, the spot near the eastern ramp where Hori had fallen. These were not monuments but memories. And though no names were carved into the great stones above, these small places held the truth of what had happened here. Not just the lifting of rock, but the living, breathing, suffering, hoping of hundreds of ordinary lives bound together by a single purpose. Some ran their fingers over the joints between blocks, not to check alignment, but to feel the presence of hands they would never see again, men who had returned to their villages. Others who had passed during the long years of labor, their bodies buried far from this place, but their spirit woven into its form. One stonemason sat for an entire afternoon beside a discarded chisel half buried in sand. Not using it, not picking it up, simply watching how the sunlight moved across its copper edge, remembering the man who had shaped limestone with it until his arms could lift no more. One evening, Nebi sat on a low step near the base, his knees drawn close to his chest, watching the shadow of the pyramid stretch across the sand like a slow hand moving westward. He had once feared this height, this scale, this defiance of nature. But now, with the work finished, he found himself missing it, the rhythm of the chant, the weight of the rope in his hands, the certainty of knowing exactly what needed to be done each day. Without it, the world felt looser, less certain. He thought of his father, who had taught him to shape stone in their village, and how proud he would have been to see his son part of something so vast. But his father had died 2 years prior, never having seen the completed pyramid, never knowing how far his son's hands had reached. Nebi did not cry. He simply sat, letting the cool air settle around him, understanding for the first time that legacy is not only what we leave behind, but what we carry forward in silence. That some men build monuments not for fame, but because it is the only way they know how to love those who will never see what they made. Ameni, the scribe, burned his notebooks, not in anger, not in rejection, but as an offering. For years he had recorded every detail, the number of blocks, the rations consumed, the weather each day, the names of team leaders. His papyri were precise, orderly, filled with neat columns of ink that told the story of construction in numbers and dates. But when the pyramid was complete, he realized no record could capture what truly mattered. The way a foreman calmed a trembling worker before a lift, the laughter shared over cracked bread at midday, the quiet dignity of men who knew they would never be remembered by name. So he lit a small fire one night and fed the scrolls to the flames, page by page, watching the words curl and vanish into smoke. He did not write a new account. He did not need to. The pyramid was the record, and those who had lived it already knew. Some truths are not written. They are carried in the body, in the way a man stands, in the way he breathes, in the stillness that follows a life of purpose. Imhotep did not stay. A week after completion, he walked away from Saqqara at dawn, carrying only a staff and a small pouch of water. He did not say farewell to anyone. He simply disappeared into the pale light, heading north along the river. Some said he went to teach in Memphis. Others believed he became a hermit, living in a cave near the cliffs, speaking only to the stars. But whatever became of him, his absence was felt deeply not as loss, but as release. He had carried the vision longer than anyone, held it in his mind before it existed in stone, protected it through doubt and uncertainty, guided it into being with patience rather than force. And now that it stood, he no longer needed to hold it. The pyramid was no longer his. It belonged to time, to memory, to the wind that would whisper over its surface long after all who built it had turned to dust. And perhaps that was always the plan, not to possess greatness, but to serve it, then let it go. In the months that followed, some workers returned to their homes with pride, yes, but also with a strange hollowness, as if a part of them had been left behind in the desert. A mason from Athribis found he could no longer sleep through the night, not because of pain or fear, but because his body missed the rhythm of labor, the early rise, the chant of the team, the satisfying thud of stone meeting stone. His wife told him he spoke in his sleep, murmuring measurements, angles, corrections. Another man, a carpenter, who had built the wooden rollers, gave away his tools and took up farming, saying he no longer wanted to shape anything meant to last. The weight of permanence, it seemed, was not always comforting. Sometimes it was a reminder of how temporary everything else truly was, that while stone endures, breath does not, that while monuments stand, hearts beat only for a season. Yet there were lessons that remained, not written in stone, but carried in the heart. One was this, that greatness does not require noise. The most enduring things are often built in silence, in repetition, in the quiet certainty of showing up day after day, even when no one is watching. Another was that doubt is not the enemy of faith, but its companion that every man who ever placed a block likely questioned. At some point, whether it would stand, whether it mattered, whether he was worthy of the task, and yet they continued. Not because they were fearless, but because they chose to trust the next step, even when the summit was hidden by dust and distance. Courage, they learned, was not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep walking anyway. And sometimes the deepest strength is not in lifting stone, but in carrying silence. There was also the lesson of impermanence within permanence. For all its strength, the pyramid was not eternal in the way they imagined. Sand would drift against its base. Wind would wear down its edges. Rain, rare as it was, would etch faint lines into its surface. Time would blur its perfection. But in that very erosion, a deeper truth emerged, that nothing lasts unchanged, not even mountains made by hands. And perhaps that is what makes the attempt so sacred, not that it defies time, but that it acknowledges it. That we build anyway, knowing we will not be here to see the end, trusting that someone, someday, will stand where we stood and feel the same quiet awe. That legacy is not about surviving, but about touching the future with intention, even if our hands are gone. Children who had grown up near the site now played differently. They no longer stacked stones into rough imitations of the pyramid. Instead, they sat at its base, leaning against the cool limestone, telling stories not of pharaohs or gods, but of the builders, the man who tasted mortar, the woman who brought water to the setters, the boy who carved birds from scrap stone. These were not legends. They were memories passed from parent to child, softened by time, shaped by love. And in those retellings, the true monument was not the structure, but the community that had risen around it, held together not by command, but by shared purpose. The pyramid did not teach people how to build. It taught them how to belong. Years later, travelers would come from distant lands to stand in the shadow of the pyramid, wondering how such a thing could have been built without machines, without modern tools, without war or slavery. They would marvel at its precision, its scale, its alignment with the stars. But those who had lived it knew the answer was simpler than any theory. It was built one decision at a time. One morning when a man chose to rise despite fatigue. One moment when a team corrected a misaligned block without complaint. One night when Imhotep walked the ramp alone, not to inspect, but to remember why they began. It was not genius alone. It was consistency. It was care. It was the quiet refusal to let a dream fade simply because it was hard. And so, the losses were real of time, of youth, of loved ones, who never saw the end, but they were not meaningless. They were woven into the fabric of what endured. The calluses on a stonemason's hands, the quiet pride in a foreman's eyes. The way a simple loaf of bread tasted different after a day of honest labor. These were not grand gestures. They were the threads of a life well lived, stitched into something greater than survival. And in that stitching, something holy was made, not in temples, not in rituals, but in the daily act of showing up, of doing good work, of believing in something beyond oneself. For those who remained near Saqqara, life slowly returned to rhythm. New projects began. Temples were repaired, fields were planted, but nothing felt quite the same. The air carried a different quality, as if the act of building toward the sky had changed the way people breathed, thought, dreamed. Some began to align their own tombs with the stars. Others taught geometry to their children. A few even whispered that Imhotep had not died, but ascended not in body, but in spirit, because a man who could make stone touch the heavens must have learned how to fly. And perhaps he did. Not with wings, but with vision. Not with force, but with stillness. Because in the end, the greatest lesson was not how to build a pyramid, but how to live a life worth remembering even. If no one speaks your name, even if the wind covers your footprints in sand, to contribute quietly, to care deeply, to continue, even when the path is unclear. That is the light that remains not in gold or stone, but in the choices we make when no one is watching. And so, the pyramid stood, not as a tomb, not as a wonder, but as a mirror for those who dared to dream, for those who doubted, for those who built anyway. One silent step at a time. Long after the last tool was laid down and the workers' village at Saqqara fell into silence, long after Imhotep had disappeared into the northern haze and the name Djoser began to blur in the mouths of children, Something new began to move through the land, a quiet awareness that what had been done could not be undone, not even by time. It was not carried in royal proclamations or shouted from temple rooftops. It lived instead, in glances held a moment too long, in pauses before answering a question. In the way a stonemason might stop mid-stroke and look toward the western plateau, where the pyramid caught the morning light like a flame that refused to die, people did not suddenly begin building monuments. They simply stopped believing that everything must vanish. They began to think differently about permanence, not as defiance of nature, but as an act of care, a gesture of love extended beyond one's own lifetime. And in that shift, the true legacy began, not in stone, but in the mind, not with noise, but with the subtle turning of thought. In the city of Memphis, a young scribe named Ptahhotep copied an old diagram from a damaged papyrus one, showing the alignment of the pyramid's chambers with the stars of Orion's belt. He did not do it for his master. He did it for himself, tracing the lines with careful strokes of his reed pen, measuring angles, recalculating distances, feeling the weight of each number as if it were a sacred object. When asked why he spent so many evenings bent over the parchment, he said only, "I want to understand how they knew." No one punished him for curiosity. No one praised him. But that night, he showed the drawing to a carpenter who visited his father's home. And the man studied it for a long time, running his fingers along the imagined walls, then said quietly, "If you can align a tomb with the sky, perhaps you can align a house with the wind, so it stays cool, so the air moves like water." From that small exchange, an idea spread, not of grand tombs, but of better living, of using knowledge not just for eternity, but for comfort, for balance, for daily peace. The wisdom of the pyramid, once meant for the afterlife, began to shape the present. Farther south, in the limestone quarries of Tura, the way stone was cut began to change. Masons no longer shaped blocks only to fit a wall or threshold. They started smoothing faces with greater care, polishing edges until they reflected light like still water, testing surfaces with their palms to feel imperfections invisible to the eye, not because anyone demanded it, but because they now carried the memory of the pyramid in their hands, the feel of lifting a perfect block, the pride in knowing it would stand for generations, the understanding that even unseen work mattered. Some began marking their work with small symbols, not names, but personal signs. A bird in flight, a single star, a ripple in sand. These were not claims of ownership, but quiet affirmations. I was here. I helped. My hands touched something that lasted. And though no overseer recorded these marks, they were seen, noticed, passed from apprentice to master, becoming part of an unspoken tradition, proof that dignity does not require recognition, only intention. In the royal court of a distant ruler, far from the Nile's main current, a vizier unrolled a scroll brought by a traveler from the west. It contained no text, only a rough sketch of the stepped pyramid at Saqqara, drawn on linen with charcoal, its tiers rising like steps into the sky. The king studied it in silence, turning it slowly in his hands, then asked, "Did they use magic?" The traveler shook his head. "No," he said. "They used ropes, ramps, water, and men who trusted one another." The king did not speak for a long time. That night, he walked to the edge of his palace garden and looked up at the stars, trying to imagine how someone could build a stairway to them without anger, without chains, without war. He did not order construction the next day. He did not summon architects. But weeks later, he asked his builders to design a tomb not buried in sand, but raised above it, its corners facing the cardinal points. Its form inspired not by power, but by stillness. When the first stone was laid, he stood beside it in silence, not as a conqueror, but as a student. And so the dream spread, not like fire, but like roots beneath the earth, unseen, patient, persistent. In villages along the delta, farmers began to align their modest burial mounds with the sunrise. It's not because they expected to rise with Ra, but because they now believed that orientation mattered, that how you face the world, even in death, carries meaning. A baker in Sais built a small mastaba for his mother, carving her favorite hymn into the inner wall, not in formal script, but in the letters she had taught him as a child. A fisherman in Buto marked his grave with a single polished stone, placed so that the first light of dawn would touch it each morning. These were not acts of imitation. They were acts of belonging to a world where dignity did not end with breath, where memory could be shaped, not just spoken. The pyramid did not command, it invited. And in that invitation, ordinary people found a new way to honor those they loved. Priests, too, began to revise their teachings, not loudly, not publicly, but in private conversations beneath temple awnings, in whispered lessons to young acolytes. For centuries, they had spoken of the afterlife as a journey through darkness, guided only by spells and amulets, judged by gods whose scales measured the heart against a feather. But now some began to describe the soul's ascent as a deliberate step-by-step movement upward, following the same path as the stars, guided not only by ritual, but by the shape of the world itself. They pointed to the pyramid not as proof of divine favor, but as a physical expression of faith, a place where the earthly and the eternal met, without conflict. One elder in Heliopolis, who had once mocked the structure as vanity, began teaching his students how to calculate slope and alignment, saying, "Even if we do not build such things, we should understand how they are made. Knowledge is never wasted, and sometimes the greatest prayer is a perfectly leveled foundation." Children grew up hearing stories not only of gods and pharaohs, but of Imhoteptha, man who listened to the stars, who walked among the workers, who believed that wisdom was stronger than force. Parents told them how he had corrected mistakes gently, taught without anger, and left no writings behind, trusting that those who lived the work would carry it forward. And so, in small homes along the river, boys and girls began to dream not only of becoming scribes or priests, but of understanding the world in deeper ways, of measuring angles, reading shadows, learning the language of balance. Education, once reserved for the elite, began to ripple outward, carried not by decree, but by curiosity. A farmer's son might spend evenings tracing diagrams in the sand. A weaver's daughter might memorize star patterns. The pyramid did not teach directly. It inspired indirection, like a single flame lighting countless others in the dark, each one flickering with the quiet belief that thought could shape matter. In the years that followed, other rulers began planning their own monuments. Not mere copies, but variations, some smoother, some taller, some buried deeper in the earth. The idea evolved, the techniques improved, the dream expanded. And though later pyramids would surpass Djosir's in height, none would carry the same quiet miracle of being the first, the moment when humanity, without fanfare, decided to reach for permanence. Each new structure bore the invisible mark of Saqqara, not in design, but in intention. They were not built to impress, they were built to endure, to honor, to remember. And though some kings sought grandeur, others sought truth, asking their architects not how tall it could be, but how well it aligned with the stars, how precisely it mirrored the order of the heavens. The pyramid had become more than a tomb. It had become a standard. And yet, the greatest legacy was not in stone, but in the way people began to see themselves. It's no longer as fleeting shadows, but as participants in something larger. A potter in Thebes started marking his finest vessels with small symbols, not just to identify his work, but because he thought, perhaps, someone might find them long after he was gone. A surveyor in Hermopolis began teaching geometry to his apprentices, not for royal projects, but because he believed understanding the world was a sacred act. Even the way people spoke changed, less of fate, more of choice, less of inevitability, more of possibility. The pyramid did not shout. It stood, and in standing, it asked a question without words. What will you leave behind? Not in gold, not in power, but in care, in precision, in the quiet refusal to let beauty fade without a fight. Pilgrimages continued, not of the religious kind, but of quiet witnessing. Men and women traveled for days to stand at the base of the structure, to place their hands on its cool surface, to walk around it in silence. They did not pray. They did not weep. They simply stood, absorbing its presence, feeling the immensity of what humans could do, when they worked not for power, but for meaning. Some stayed for hours. Others camped nearby for nights, sleeping beneath the same stars that had watched over the builders. And when they returned home, they carried nothing physical, no relics, no souvenirs, but something deeper, the certainty that beauty order, and endurance were not myths, but choices. A single decision repeated every day could become a mountain. That greatness is not born in moments of glory, but in the thousand small acts of patience that no one sees. Years passed. Generations rose and fell. The names of those who built the pyramid faded from record. Their faces vanished. Their voices turned to dust. But the structure remained, not untouched. Sand drifted against its base. Wind softened its edges. Rain etched faint lines into its surface, but still standing, still whole, still pointing toward the sky. And in that endurance, a new truth emerged. That legacy is not about surviving unchanged, but about leaving an imprint so deep that even erosion cannot erase it. The pyramid was not eternal, but it was close enough to make people believe in continuity. Close enough to remind them that while flesh returns to earth, thought, care, and vision can outlive bone and breath. So the world moved, not in leaps, but in waves. A whisper here, a question there, a child stacking stones in the sand, a scribe copying a diagram, a farmer aligning his grave with the east. The pyramid did not command attention, simply existed in existing. It invited reflection. It asked nothing. It offered everything. Okay. Because once you have seen what patient hands can do, you no longer accept that all things must fade. You begin to believe that even the smallest act, done with care, can echo across centuries. That a life well lived is not measured in years, but in the quiet ripples it leaves behind. Because legacy is not what is carved into stone. It is what is carried in silence. It is the way a man looks at the stars and thinks, perhaps I too can build something that lasts. Not for glory, not for memory, but because it feels right to leave something beautiful behind. Long after the last echo of chisels faded from the plateau of Saqqara and the workers who shaped stone had returned to their villages or passed, quietly into the long night, time began to gather around the pyramid like wind circling a mountain, slow and patient, neither hostile nor kind, simply present. That did not come with force, not as a storm or conquest, but as a gradual settling, like dust on an altar, like silence after a song, like the way memories soften at the edges, but never truly vanish. The structure did not age as living things do. It did not grow weak or forgetful. Instead, it changed through absence, through the silencing of voices, the softening of edges by sand, the gradual forgetting of names that once belonged to those who built it. No one carved Imhotep's story into its walls. No scribe recorded the laughter shared beneath midday shade, or the way a foreman once tasted mortar to ensure its strength. These were not deemed worthy of permanence, and yet they lived on in the silence between breaths, in the way people looked at the horizon and thought, for just a moment, about what lasts. Centuries passed without fanfare. Floods came and receded. Kings rose and fell. New cities grew along the Nile, while others vanished beneath dust. Temples were rebuilt, gods renamed, languages shifted like dunes under wind. But through it all, the pyramid remained a constant in an ever-changing world, not untouched, but unbroken. Its white limestone casing, once polished to catch the dawn, was stripped away over time by hands seeking fine stone for other buildings. Leaving only the rough core visible, its stepped form still unmistakable against the sky. Sand drifted against its eastern face, burying part of the base, then was blown clear again, revealing inscriptions to warn to read. Seasons cycled, years folded into decades, and still it stood, not because it resisted time, but because it accepted it allowing erosion, whether even neglect, without collapsing. As if it understood that endurance is not perfection but continuity, that to remain, you do not have to be flawless. You only have to be true. In distant lands, travelers spoke of it as a marvel, though few had seen it. A Greek merchant crossing the desert told his children of a stairway built by giants, aligned with the stars, where the dead walked upward into light. A Persian scholar wrote of a tomb so precise that shadows moved across its surface like clockwork, marking hours even at night. These stories were not true, not exactly, but they carried truth within them, the recognition that something profound had been done here, something beyond mere construction. The real details were lost: how many men worked, how long it took, what words were spoken at dawn, but the feeling remained. The awe, the sense that humanity for one brief moment had reached toward eternity and touched it with calloused hands. And sometimes that feeling is more powerful than fact, because it lives not in records, but in the heart. Temples that once stood near the site crumbled into ruin, their painted walls flaking, their columns fallen. The village where the builders lived was buried beneath layers of dust and time, rediscovered millennia later by archaeologists who found breadcrumbs preserved in jars, sandals made of reeds, and papyri listing rations and shifts. These fragments did not tell grand tales of glory. They told of ordinary livesmen who ate onions and drank beer, who laughed, argued, missed their families, dreamed under stars. One scrap of papyrus bore a note from a worker named Nebi to his brother. "The sun is strong today, but the work moves well. I think we are making something that will stand." These were not official records. They were personal thoughts, written quickly, never meant to survive, and yet they did. Not because they were carved in stone, but because someone chose to write them down. Because memory begins not in monuments, but in moments. Priests who once guarded the rituals of the dead eventually forgot the exact meaning of the pyramid's shape. Was it a stairway? Primordial mound rising from chaos? Representation of the sun's rays solidified into stone? Different generations offered different answers. None certain, all respectful. Hymns evolved, prayers shifted, but the act of honoring the structure never ceased. Even when new pyramids were built smoother, taller, or refined, the smooth-sided monuments of Giza, they carried the invisible imprint of Saqqara. The knowledge that ascent was possible, that order could be carved from disorder, that vision could precede reality by years, even lifetimes. The first pyramid did not need to be the tallest to be the most important. It only needed to be the first to prove that what had never been done could be imagined, planned, and completed, one block at a time, by people who believed in balance, care, and patience. Children born hundreds of years after the last stone was laid still played near the base, though they no longer knew the names of those who built it. They sat where Nebi once sat, leaned against the same cool limestone, and listened to elders tell stories softened by time, of a wise man who spoke to the stars, of workers who moved mountains without anger, of a night when the first light of dawn filled the capstone with fire. These were not facts, were myths shaped by longing, by the human need to believe that greatness is not only possible, but has already happened. And perhaps that is the truest legacy, not the stone itself, but the dream it inspired passed from parent to child, generation after generation, like a flame relit each evening. Because dreams do not die, they change form. They become stories, they become questions. They become the quiet voice that says, "What if we tried?" Scholars came much later, long after Egypt had become a memory in foreign textbooks, drawn by fragments of records, by vague references in ancient scrolls. They measured angles, studied alignments, dug carefully through sand, uncovering tools, bones, inscriptions. They pieced together timelines, debated dates, reconstructed faces from skulls. But no amount of research could capture the rhythm of labor. The sound of a rope tightening before a lift, the warmth of shared bread at dusk. What they found was evidence, not experience. Data, not life. And yet some of them stood in silence at the base, removed their shoes, placed a hand on the stone, felt something stern, awareness that they were touching not just rock, but time, not just history, but the accumulated breath of thousands who believed in care, precision, and patience. One young archaeologist, far from home, whispered her mother's name into the wind and felt, for the first time, that remembrance was not about permanence, but presence. The name Djoser faded from common speech, surviving only in damaged papyri and scholars' notes. Imhotep became something else entirely, not a man, but a legend. Some said he was a god of healing. Others claimed he invented writing, medicine, architecture. None of these were true, not exactly, but they carried a deeper truth that his presence had mattered, not because of power, but because of wisdom. That leadership could be quiet, that knowledge could outlive empires. And though no statue bore his likeness in those early years, his mind shaped the unseen currents of history, reminding future generations that the greatest structures are not built with force, but with thought. that a single decision made in stillness can ripple across centuries. That to build something lasting, you must first believe it is possible even when no one else does. Pilgrims continued to come not because they worshipped the dead, but because they sought stillness. Men and women traveled for days across dry land to stand in the shadow of the pyramid, not to pray aloud, but to feel the weight of silence, to let their thoughts settle like dust after a storm. They did not leave offerings of gold or incense. Some placed a single pebble at the base. Others whispered a name of a mother, a child, someone they had lost. These gestures were small, fleeting, but meaningful, because in that moment they were not visitors. They were participants in a ritual older than language, the act of remembering, not perfectly, not completely, but sincerely. And sincerity, more than grandeur, is what endures, because it does not demand attention, it simply exists, like a star seen only on the clearest nights. And so, the pyramid became more than a tomb, more than a monument. It became a vessel for memory, not only of those who built it, but of those who encountered it long after. A farmer centuries later might look up at it and think of his father's hands. A scribe might study its alignment and feel the presence of minds long gone. A traveler from a distant land might touch its surface and understand, without words, that humans have always tried to reach beyond themselves, not with violence, not with conquest, but with care, with vision. With the quiet refusal to let everything vanish. It did not teach through command. It taught through being, through standing, through enduring, through saying nothing and meaning everything. Seasons turned, empires rose and fell, cities burned and were rebuilt. Ships crossed oceans, planes flew above clouds, and messages traveled instantly across the world. Yet, through every change, the pyramid remained a silent witness, not judging, not commanding, simply being. Not eternal, but close enough to make people pause and wonder what else might endure. Not perfect, but true. Because it was not built to impress, it was built to honor, to remember, to say across the vast stretch of time, we were here, we dreamed, we tried, and sometimes that is enough, not to be known, not to be praised. Just to have contributed in some small way to the long chain of human effort that stretches from the first fire to the stars we now watch from afar. Years became centuries. Centuries became millennia. The voices of those who built it turned to dust. Their footprints vanished, their names blurred. But the structure stood, not untouched, not unchanged, but whole. And in its endurance, a quiet lesson gathered around it, one that needed no words, no proclamations, no grand teachings. It was simply there, catching the morning light, casting long shadows at dusk, holding space for anyone who wished to remember that even the shortest life can leave a mark that outlives stone. That legacy is not what is carved into limestone, but what is carried in silence, in the way a teacher speaks of patience, in the way a builder checks his work twice, in the way a child places a flower at the base of something ancient and says nothing at all. Because time does not erase everything. It gathers around certain moments, certain places, certain acts of care, as if recognizing them for what they are, not victories, not triumphs, but whispers that refuse to fade. And if you listen closely, even now, beneath the wind moving over the plateau, you can still hear them, the soft echo of ropes tightening, the murmur of a chant, the breath of men who lifted stone not for glory, because it felt right to build something beautiful, one quiet step at a time. These sounds are not loud, do not demand attention. But they are there, woven into the air, into the sand, into the stillness of night, waiting for someone willing to slow down, to breathe, to listen. And so, the memory lives not in books, not in museums, but in the quiet choices people make when no one is watching. In the way a student studies geometry not for grades, but to understand balance. In the way a mason polishes a stone not because it will be seen, but because it feels right to do good work. In the way someone stands before an ancient structure and places their hand on its surface, not to take, but to connect.
Oh.
The pyramid did not ask to be remembered, it only asked to exist. And in existing, it taught the deepest lesson of all, that to build something that lasts, you do not need power. You only need care. You only need time. You only need to believe, even quietly, that it matters. Even now, thousands of years after the last hand touched its stone. The pyramid continues to speak not in words, not in proclamations, but in silence, so deep it feels like a breath held across centuries. You do not need to stand before it to hear it, you only need to be still. To close your eyes, to remember that someone once believed something could last. Not because they demanded it, but because they cared enough to shape it slowly, patiently, with hands that did not rush, with minds that measured not just distance but meaning. And in that slowness, in that precision, in that refusal to cut corners, even when no one was watching, that is where the echo begins. Not in grandeur, but in integrity. Not in size, but in sincerity. Because what endures is not always what shouts. It is what whispers long after the noise has faded, carried not by wind, but by the quiet choices we make when we believe that doing good work matters, even if no one sees it. In cities far from the Nile, where steel towers rise into smoggy skies and life moves at a pace that leaves little room for reflection, there are moments when the spirit of Saqqara returns, quietly, unexpectedly, without announcement. A student sits late at night studying geometry, not for a test, not for grades, but because she finds peace in the way angles meet. In the certainty of lines that align, in the way a triangle can hold weight without breaking if every side is true. She does not know about Imhotep. She has never seen the desert, but she is continuing his work. Elsewhere, a builder checks the level of a wall for the third time, adjusting it by a fraction of an inch. Not because anyone will notice, but because he knows it matters. Because he cannot leave it unfinished. Because something in him refuses to accept that imperfection is inevitable. He does not call it sacred. He calls it right. These are not monuments. They are echoes, small gestures that carry forward the same belief. That care is never wasted, that balance has value, that doing good work is its own reward, and that the smallest act of attention can ripple across time in ways we may never see. Parents tell their children stories not of conquest or power, but of patience, of men who moved mountains without anger, who trusted each other, who believed in something they would never see completed. These tales are not exact. They blur details. They soften edges. But they keep alive the heart of what happened, the quiet courage of showing up day after day, not for fame but for purpose, not for glory, but for the simple satisfaction of knowing you gave your best. And sometimes, a child lies awake at night, staring at the ceiling, imagining what it would feel like to build something that lasts. It's not to impress, but to honor. Not to be remembered, but to matter. Or that thought, fragile as it seems, is itself a continuation, a new thread woven into the same fabric, spun not from limestone or gold, but from intention, from hope, from the quiet understanding that legacy is not built in moments, but in rhythms. Artisans still shape stone, wood, clay, not because they expect immortality, but because they love the rhythm of creation. A potter centers clay on a wheel, her hands moving with practiced ease, listening to the silence between breaths, feeling the subtle resistance of the material as it rises into form. She does not think of pyramids. She thinks only of making something true, something balanced, something that feels whole in the hands. But in that focus, in that dedication to form and balance, she honors those who came before. A carpenter sands the edge of a table until it feels smooth under his palm. It's not because the customer will check, but because he cannot leave it unfinished, because he knows that even unseen work carries weight. These acts are small. They are private. But they ripple outward, touching lives in ways no one can measure. Because legacy is not only what stands for centuries, it is also what inspires someone to do their best. Even when no one is watching, even when the world rushes past, even when no one applauds. Scientists study the stars not only to understand the universe, but to feel connection, to know that humans have always looked upward. Seeking meaning, tracing patterns, believing that order exists beyond chaos. An astronomer aligns a telescope with Orion's belt and pauses, not because the data requires it, but because she remembers reading years ago that this constellation guided the builders of the first pyramid, that they used its position to align their structure with the heavens, not out of superstition, but out of reverence for the cosmos. She does not worship them. She does not revere them. But she feels kinship, a shared desire to understand, to align, to reach beyond what is known, to believe that knowledge can be a bridge between earth and sky. And in that moment, the distance between past and present vanishes, not through technology, but through intention, not through force, but through the quiet persistence of curiosity. Teachers pass down knowledge not as dogma, but as invitation. They do not say this is how it was. They say, let us wonder together, in classrooms. Students trace the slope of the pyramid's sides, calculate its volume, debate its purpose not to memorize facts, but to learn how people once dreamed in stone, how vision can precede reality by decades, how unity can achieve what force never could. Some grow bored. Others lean forward, eyes bright, asking questions that have no answer, wondering what it must have felt like to place a block, knowing you would never see the final form. That curiosity is not taught, it is awakened. And it carries the same spark that lived in Imhotep. When he first looked at the stars and asked, what if? The pyramid does not live in Egypt alone. It lives in every mind that dares to imagine what might be possible. In every heart that believes that patience, care, and clarity can shape the world. Even in grief, the echo remains. When someone places a flower on a grave, when a widow speaks her husband's name into the wind, when a son finishes a task his father began but could not complete, these are not acts of the past. They are expressions of the same belief that built the pyramid, that love does not vanish just because breath stops, that remembrance is a kind of construction that we build not only with stone but with memory, with ritual, with the quiet refusal to let someone be forgotten. And though no capstone catches the dawn above these moments, they shine all the psalm in the heart, in the breath, in the space between one generation and the next. The pyramid was never only a tomb. It was a declaration that we do not have to disappear completely, that we can leave behind something gentle, something true, something that says, simply, we were here. You may never walk the plateau of Saqqara, may never place your hand on its limestone, but you have already met it, to the part of you that values patience over speed, care over convenience, depth over appearance. It lives in the way you pause before speaking harshly, in the way you revise your work, not because it's required, but because you want it to be true, in the way you listen when someone else talks, not waiting to reply, but truly hearing. These are not grand gestures, they are quiet ones. And yet they are the very things that outlive noise, that endure, that matter, because the greatest structures are not always made of stone. They are made of moments of kindness, offered without expectation, of effort given without reward, of presence maintained without applause. Because the true legacy of the pyramid was never its height. It was the mindset it represented, the belief that humans could plan, cooperate, endure, and create something meaningful without violence, without enslavement, without hatred. That greatness could be built not on fear, but on unity. Not on force, but on vision. And though later ages would forget this truth, though empires would rise through conquest, the example remains silent, steady, waiting for someone willing to look closely, to listen deeply, to believe that another way is possible, that progress does not require destruction, that permanence can be achieved through care, that the most powerful force in history is not war, but patience. And so, the whisper continues. In the architect who designs homes for the homeless, not for awards, but for dignity. In the nurse who stays late to comfort a patient with no family. In the farmer who plants trees he will never sit under. In the writer who spends years on a book no one may read, simply because the story needed to be told. These are not replicas of the pyramid. They are variations on its theme, the quiet insistence that our time here can mean something. Not because we shout, but because we care. Not because we seek credit, but because we cannot do otherwise. And in each of these acts, the same ancient dream lives on, that we are not merely passing through, that we can leave something behind, we can build. You do not need to build a monument to leave a mark. You only need to live with intention, to choose kindness when indifference is easier, to finish what you begin, to treat each task, no matter how small, as worthy of your attention. Because history is not only made in battles and coronations, it is also made in stillness, in repetition, in the 1,000 invisible decisions that shape a life well lived. And when you do these things, you are not alone. You are standing beside Nebi Ameni Hori Imhotep, not in body, but in spirit. You are part of the same chain, stretching back through time, held together not by stone, but by care, not by command, but by continuity, not by memory, but by action. So if you ever wonder whether your efforts matter, whether your presence makes a difference, remember the pyramid, not as a tomb, not as a wonder, but as proof that slow, patient, thoughtful action can outlive empires. That a single decision to do good work, repeated every day, can become something eternal, not in gold, not in fame, but in influence, in inspiration, in the way someone years from now might look at the world and say, I want to build something that lasts, and find, without knowing why, that the path was already laid, that others had walked it before, quietly, gently, one step at a time, believing not in perfection, but in care, because the echoes are still whispering from within you, in the quiet certainty that care is never wasted, that beauty matters, that you too are building something that will outlive you, one gentle step at a time, not through force, but through presence, not through noise, but through stillness, not through being seen, but through being true. And though no capstone will catch the dawn above your daily choices, the light is there in the way you show up, in the way you listen, in the way you continue even when no one is watching, because in that continuation the ancient dream lives on, and you are part of it now, and always. If you are still listening, there is a good chance your eyes are closed, your breath has slowed, and your thoughts have begun to drift like sand carried on a night wind. That is exactly where you should be. There is no need to respond, no need to move. You have already given your presence, and that is more than enough. Thank you for walking this path with me, for stepping so quietly into a world long gone, not to conquer it with questions, but to feel it, to breathe its air, to stand for a moment beside those who lifted stone beneath a sky full of stars. You did not come for facts alone. You came for feeling, for connection, for the kind of peace that only stories told softly can bring. The pyramid still stands. It's not as it once was, not untouched by time, but whole in spirit, enduring in meaning. Oh, the hands that shaped it have returned to dust. Their care remains in the way we align our lives with intention, in the way we choose patience over haste, in the quiet decisions we make when no one is watching. You do not need to build a monument to leave a mark. You only need to live with attention, with kindness, with the gentle certainty that even small things matter. Because history is not only made in great events, it is also made here, in stillness, in breath, in the soft weight of a blanket over your shoulders, in the way you allow yourself to rest after a long day. If you would like to share where in time or space you're listening from, you can leave a comment below. It helps others feel less alone in the dark, knowing someone else, somewhere far away, is also letting go, also drifting, also remembering. But if words feel too heavy tonight, that is all right. Silence is welcome here. Stillness is welcome. You are welcome exactly as you are. Let yourself sink a little deeper now. Let your body soften, your jaw unclench, your shoulders release the weight they have carried. The story has ended, but the calm does not have to. Breathe slowly, breathe deeply, and know that you are not separate from what came before. You are part of the same long chain of human hearts trying to do their best, trying to build something true, trying to leave behind not noise, but meaning. And if you ever return, I will be here with another story, another quiet journey through time, another invitation to rest beneath the same stars that once watched over builders, dreamers, and wanderers just like you. Until then, let the silence hold you. Let the night carry you. Let your dreams be soft and your sleep deep, because you too are remembered, not by name carved in stone, but by presence felt in the quiet, and that is enough. Good night.